Why don't you take a seat? Tell me what's wrong. I thought what I would do in 2021 is rekindle a video series that I used to do that I think was fairly popular and that at some point I stopped doing, and I don't remember fully why. Now, I want to keep this introduction very brief, but the series was called Consult the Doctor, and basically people submit fountain pen questions which I then try to answer to the best of my abilities. Now, I don't think you can catch me, but do watch all the nearly 2,000 videos to make sure I'm not lying. I don't believe I've ever self-applied the term fountain pen expert, but I have been using pens for a number of years. When I say pens, I mean fountain pens, for a number of years, and that means that I have learned a thing or two doing so. So, I thought what we would do today is rekindle that series, and one of my reasons is not just that I kind of like doing it, I also had the feeling that people enjoyed those videos, but you will understand that I get a lot of questions, both on YouTube and email, actually not both, on YouTube and email, and Instagram, and Twitter, and Facebook, and pretty much everything else. So certain questions come back again and again and again and again and again and so on. So I thought what we would do today is try and dig into some of these, and I'll actually make the effort to make timestamps too, so you can actually find what you're looking for. So the first question, because let's not waste any more time on this than we need to. The first question was asked on Instagram when I had a sort of ask me things, and I think I got about 400 questions, and I thought I would be able to see them afterwards, but it turns out that after 24 hours they disappear and they're not actually archived. I'm so sorry. If you had a question, I sincerely apologize. Leave it as a comment below. Now, this is one that I remembered though, and I don't remember who asked me, I just remember the question. Is the Montblanc Calligraphy nib, so that is Montblanc's flex nib, any good? Well, I have reviewed it, so the simplest way to judge it, I think, is to look at the review simply so you can see it in action. But having said that, I was quite impressed by that nib, and I am not a massive Montblanc user, given that I own 0 Montblanc pens, but that one I really was quite impressed by. I thought it offered a very nice amount of line variation. It also has pretty good snapback, so it goes back to the thin line quite easily. And overall, I thought it performed really quite well. It also kept up with ink demand relatively well, and it wrote out of the box, which, in all honesty, is more than I can say for some of the more inexpensive modern flex nib options. So I was quite impressed. Of course, you also pay heavily for this, given that it is a Montblanc nib, but if that is worth it to you, you have that money lying around, then I think you could do a lot worse than get that nib if you want a modern take on flex. The next question is related to this, and that is, this was a question from Will on Instagram. I'm condensing it a little bit here, but the basics are, why aren't modern flex nibs as good as vintage flex nibs? Well, that's the million-dollar question, to which I have read many answers now over the years, and I can try to very briefly share them all with you. The first, and I'm sorry, I'm not citing sources because that's probably going to lead to what we cognitive psychologists call a source attribution error. I'm going to misattribute the source because I don't remember exactly who told me what and where I read what. So please forgive me. One explanation I have heard is that vintage flex nibs were forged, whereas modern flex nibs are stamped out of sheets of metal. I'm just presenting the theories, and then we shall see. You'll have to make up your mind, because I don't think anyone has the correct answer. I've also read that from a metallurgical perspective, things have changed. So the old alloys used by the good old companies like, say, Waterman, or the old While Ever Sharp, or Conklin, or whatever, have disappeared. They were gone. Okay? So I always wonder a bit about that, because if you look at a company like Waterman, it's still in existence. Now, Waterman, I do not believe, currently has a flex nib option in its lineup, but I find it hard to believe that collectively all these companies would have lost the ability to create flex nibs. I do think that there currently is a strong demand for more rigid nibs. I'm not saying super rigid, I'm saying more rigid nibs, because people don't really write in, say, copper plate anymore, which you kind of need a dip nib for, but you get the point. That kind of writing with the thin lines, thick lines, thin lines, thick lines, etc. We don't really do that anymore. So I wonder how much demand in everyday writing that truly is for flex nibs. Which, if there isn't that much, might be why these companies don't offer it. But then if Montblanc offers their own flex nib, then surely there is a demand. And let's be fair, as soon as, I mean, I'm not a pen vendor, but I can say that when I review a pen that has a flex nib, the number of views on that specific review shoot up relative to other reviews. So people like flex, and I especially think sometimes that people like the idea of flex. But unfortunately, the handwriting doesn't come with the nib, but comes with practice. But I digressed a bit, which is something I never do. So what do we have? We have forged versus stamped. We have some sort of magical lost alloy. I've also enjoyed, and I think these two theories are kind of related a bit. I think this one came from Richard Binder, but again, I could be making a source attribution error. One theory I've read was that flex nibs on fountain pens actually never were flex nibs, or that many of them were not flex nibs, but that over the years, and think about it, some of these nibs we use are from the early 1900s, for example, so that's quite a long time ago, given that this is 2021 Anno Domini. Maybe they've just weakened, right? Maybe those nibs have just weakened over time, structurally speaking, and as a result, they just don't really function the way they used to function, which is that they were more rigid than they are now. And related to that is the theory that you just get minuscule hairline cracks and fissures that just make the nib flexier than it ever was. And many flex nibs that you can find do have very minute cracks or develop cracks around the breather hole. So it could be something like that as well. Now, I'm sure there are other theories out there. The shape of the nib, the longer and thinner the tines are, the more it typically flexes. Look, for example, at the Namiki Falcon, which has that, the very long, skinny tines. That could be part of the issue. Maybe we just don't make nibs like that anymore. So I will try to, and again, I'm trying to be brief, which is always a challenge for me. So I'll try to add two observations. One is the alloy story is complicated. For example, I always mention this pen, but just because I had that experience with it. On the Platinum 3776, I had one, I reviewed it many, many years ago. The music nib, the 3776 music nib from Platinum, is a 14 karat nib. It is rigid as a nail. It has 3 tines, but they do not spread open under pressure. They are very, very rigid. Then you might say, well, it's only 14K, but I mean, many of the vintage flex nibs that people love so much that are so soft are 14 karat, right? So what if you add more gold? Gold is a soft metal. Well, I have used 18K nibs that were softer than the 14K nibs, but I have also used quite a lot of Sailor nibs, and the Sailor nibs are 21 carat gold. I keep saying Karen, 23 Karen gold. That's really weird. 21 carat gold, and they are very rigid. So even those nibs that are very close to being pure gold, 24 carat pure gold, 21 carat Sailor nib, are not soft. They are rigid. I mean, every nib is a flex nib once, but beyond that, I wouldn't recommend using a Sailor nib as a flex nib. So the gold content story, I could sort of see that alloy story having a kernel of truth, because I'm sure that depending on what else you put in the alloy, it may be softer or more rigid, but I'm not a metallurgist. And I think it's, again, also the shape of the nib. I remember that Platinum Music nibs to be quite short and stocky and not long, thin tines. So there's the geometry of the nib, there is the alloy of the nib, and beyond that, I just don't know. And I think your guess is as good as mine. Final thing I'll add is there's also the continuous issue of wet noodle vintage flex nibs, in other words, super flexy 14 karat nibs on vintage pens with ebonite feeds that keep going and going and going and going, and then pretty much every modern flex nib that railroads to thin lines of ink, right, almost immediately. I don't know what that is either, because take a pen like, or take some pens like the, say, the Noodler's pens, which have an ebonite feed. Well, the vintage pens had ebonite feeds. A lot of people prefer ebonite feeds. It has very good ink flow. And yet, you get much more railroading. So then, sup with that, right? That's another issue to consider, that it's not just the flexibility of the nib, because there are flex nibs, modern flex nibs, that are very soft and that will open up very far, but the ink demand just cuts out before you even get to writing a couple of letters like that. So, I don't know. It was one that I had to address. It's a complicated one. Next one. This question is about the Leonardo MomentoZero pens. There's the MomentoZero Grande and the MomentoZero Furore Grande. The question was, can you swap nibs? I don't see why not. I had a MomentoZero Grande. I have a Momento Z. It's two different models. I've had a Leonardo MomentoZero Grande and a Leonardo Furore Grande. And actually the MomentoZero Grande had the old style Bock nib. The Furore Grande had the newer Jovo nib that Leonardo uses now, and I could swap them out without issue. Both came out friction fit, were swapped, were pushed in, and they worked. There was no leakage, there was no problem fitting it, there was no unscrewing of nib collars, they slid out easily, no problem. One small suggestion, if you are going to do that, if you have trouble removing the nib, draw up a little bit of water, maybe let it soak overnight, so there's a little bit of lubrication in the nib and feed. The next question was a little longer, so if you will forgive me, I'm going to read it out loud from Instagram. Fiddle Twist asks, Dear Doctor, why is it that I can flush my pen over and over with a bulb syringe till it runs clean, but if I wipe the nib with a paper towel, ink still comes out the slit and breathe a hole? Where is it hiding? I have taken to using a syringe to shoot water under the nib, but even that doesn't always finish the job. And GPNGTS responds saying the water follows the path of least resistance, which is usually through the breather/filler slit on the underside of the feed. Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer, and I don't have necessarily a whole lot to add to that. But what I will say is, what I have found, and you have to try and picture what I'm saying here. If I'm going to do my best. If this is the nib collar, right, so the part of the pen into which the nib on top and the feed at the bottom are slid in, and then usually the nib collar is screwed into the grip section of the pen. What I have found when cleaning pens very, very, very well, if sometimes I want to do that, is that sometimes ink gets trapped between the top of the nib and the underside, the inside of the nib collar. So what I'm talking about is this. Here's the nib collar. I know it would close, but I'm just leaving my hand open so you can see what I'm doing. And here is the nib. The nib slides into the nib collar like this. This would be the tipping end, so the end that touches the paper that you write with, right? But part of that nib is in the nib collar. And I have found, and you can try this if you have, I'm just going to sit back and relax. If you have a pen where you can easily slip out the nib and feed from the nib collar because they're friction fit, see online to figure out if that is the case for your pen, right? So if you do that, back to the demonstration, so if you do this, note that the nib was slid in up to that point. If you do that, then on this side, you can find ink. Sometimes a lot of ink. And sometimes, but this often doesn't happen, sometimes if you can screw out the entire nib assembly, so now you have the nib unit, nib and feed in a nib collar, you unscrew the whole thing, then everything comes out. Sometimes I even find some ink on the outside of the nib collar. So I think the answer given here was a perfect answer. I don't know what else to say. I think it is that path of least resistance. And remember, feeds have very thin channels that can easily have a bit of ink left in it. But I would also check out those bits if you can. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend taking a pen apart every single time you clean it, because you don't want to wear out any parts and make sure that things get stretched out and don't fit properly anymore. But once in a while, you can probably get away with that. Some pens are also designed like that. I mentioned Noodlers before. They're really meant to be taken apart completely, and then it's very easy. Also, if you have a demonstrator where you can see the entire nib, right? For example, it slides straight into the section is transparent. You can often see the ink trapped there. I don't really have a point with this beyond saying that may well be where the mysterious ink comes from. And then sometimes, if you can unscrew the whole nib unit, or if you can pull out the nib and feed, toss those in ultrasonic cleaner, and then see how much more ink comes out of the feed. Not so much the nib typically, but the feed. Whoa. Right. So, this was about 18 minutes. I think under 20 minutes is a nice length for these types of videos. I hope this was useful. Please let me know in the comments below if you thought this was helpful or useful or interesting or entertaining, because after all, let me entertain you, etc. And secondly, please leave any further questions, okay? Questions you may have. I hope this was useful, and I'll gladly see you later. Bye-bye.